Minister, dropout rates for students, undergraduates, have jumped in recent times, very, very significantly, up to 15%, which is a shockingly high figure. First years, for example, the number who dropped out in first years across higher education was up to 5,000, up from 9% to 12%, a huge jump. There's a whole load of factors: cost of accommodation, transport, travelling long distances, but also the issue of mental health and the impact of the pandemic and the lack of mental health supports for students. So I want to know what you are going to do to try and address these very worrying increases in dropout rates for undergraduate students.
Deputy, first thing to say, I suppose, is that dropout rates don't often factor in people who may have moved from one course to another within an institution, and that just is important to actually say, because I think many of us will know somebody who might have started one degree or one area of study and moved to another area as well. But the Deputy is is absolutely right to highlight this issue. Ensuring that students succeed and thrive in their higher educational journey is an important issue for me and my department. The HEA does publish data on the proportion of students who don't progress from first to second year of higher education. The latest figures published by the HEA in relation to students who commenced in 2020 and 2021 and consider progression to the 21 to 22 academic year. Over the past decade, the data did show a gradual downward trend in non-progression rates from 16% for new entrants in 2010 to 2011 to 12%, which is the figure the Deputy references now. I do think, though, that the figures are a little bit skewed, because the Deputy does point out that that figure did drop to 9% in 2019 and 2020. However, this was heavily impacted by the exceptional circumstances caused by the COVID pandemic, and the non-progression rate has subsequently reverted to the pre-pandemic level of 12%. So look, in 2010, 2011, about 16% of students were not progressing. That dropped to about 12%. It did drop to 9 for a brief period. It's now back at 12. It's down from 16, though, objectively. However, my department is aware of some reporting regarding an increase in student withdrawals. The latest data and analysis is not yet available to me, and my understanding is that the figures on the progression rates are scheduled to be released by the HEA in the first quarter of 2024. More generally, it's important to say that where a student does withdraw from third level education, it can be for a variety of reasons, and changes in the progression rates are rarely influenced by any one single factor. In fairness, as you acknowledged, in Budget 2024, I have sought to try and support students in what could be a number of those issues by reducing the fees, by increasing the grants, by extending the rental tax credit, also by securing an additional investment of €60 million in core funding for the universities. And what does core funding for the universities mean? Well, it means more academic tutors, more guidance, more medical assistance, more mental health supports, more counselling and other support services that could be very vital to many students.
Yeah, well, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to work out why people will be dropping out. Of course, if you were actually studying to be a rocket scientist, you'd be living on less than the living income, as we know from our PhD students. Well, I suppose we've covered that ground. But you mentioned the increase in core funding. The government accepted that there was a shortfall of 307 million for core funding, but in the budget you only gave 60 million. Very, very significantly short of what's necessary. And of course that then puts pressure on the services that should be provided, counselling services and other services, by the third level institutions. It also then puts pressure on them to jack up rents to ridiculous levels. I mean, some of the rents that are being charged by universities for their own accommodation are just off the charts for most students. But it is accommodation, first of all. And what have we done to actually increase the delivery of more affordable student accommodation, properly funding the universities, and things like counselling services?
Thank you, Deputy. You get a chance to come back in.
So firstly, I'm not in any way buying into the thesis that, to use your phrase, jacking up rents needs to happen by any university, because factually, and you'll have to agree with me on this point because it is a factual point, universities have seen an increase in their budget this coming year compared to last year compared to the year before. So there's no excuse, and that should not be used as a fig leaf. And in fact, a number of universities are reducing their cost of student accommodation, and I pointed to the University of Galway as one example where they've reduced the cost of a majority. Not all are, I take that point, but they shouldn't use, if anyone is using that as an excuse, that should be called out for the codology that it is. Let's talk about these figures though, because a lot of figures are floating around. The Cassell's report many years ago said there was €1 billion that needed to go in extra to the higher education sector. When I became Minister, we got the European Commission and Indicon to do an up-to-date report. Where are we now at in Ireland? That 1 billion figure had become 307 million. So it is factually true we need to inject 307 million more in our higher education system to be at a sustainable level of funding. That gets us to better student ratios and the likes. We put in 60 million more this year's budget, 40 million of it last year. We've also given 35 million for pay, 50 million and more for university pensions. So we are making real progress, but no one said we'd put in the 307 million in one budget. That's not realistic.
Well, I certainly agree there's no excuse for universities jacking up rents to unaffordable levels. I'm simply pointing out if you underfund them, then they start to look for ways to increase revenue, and they start to operate more like businesses and less like institutes of higher education. But it's no excuse, and of course often the rents are pushed down because students actually get out and protest about it, and I just commend the students who have done that recently. But there is, first of all, a massive shortfall in the availability of affordable student accommodation. What are you planning to do? USI have asked for 30,000 additional affordable student beds by 2029. Are you going to meet that demand? Because that's the sort of scale of what is necessary if we're going to do what's necessary. And to refer to my earlier point, you know, in a choice between hundreds and hundreds of millions of going in research and development tax breaks to some of the richest companies in the world, or giving it to our universities to fund them properly, I know which one I'd choose.
Thank you, Deputy.
Look, often rents are also kept down, Deputy Boyd Barrett, in universities because we extended the rent pressure zones to our universities, and that has been a very significant assistance in keeping rents a lot lower than they would have actually been. When you talk sometimes about investment in universities, when you talk about investment in universities, sometimes you'd swear the investment was actually going the wrong direction. I mean, our universities got permission last year to be able to permanently recruit 1,500 more staff. Last year was the first year in many years we saw a drop, an improvement in the student-staff ratio. They've got 60 million more to build on that this year. Student accommodation, meeting USI next week, I believe. We have projects underway in DCU, Maynooth UL, University of Galway. We want to work with UCD and Trinity to get them over the line, and we will publish a new student accommodation strategy by the end of the year.